Felice, welcome to Against the Grain.
Thank you for having me.
So we first met, I think it was at
I think it was in December at the Living Freedom Forum.
Yes. Yeah, so Living Freedom, could you maybe describe what that is?
I've only kind of gotten into it this year, but it's these events that go on throughout the year. So they have a summer school, which is coming up actually next weekend. And then like forums throughout the year. There was recently one on AI and the implications for freedom. And it generally deals with freedom and how we make a positive case for freedom in the world we live in today. In various ways.
Yeah, because that one in particular talked about technology. I think I was actually a speaker at this one, so I can remember it very well. But just a place of technology for a free society and what that means in democracy as well. And, you know, we're based in London at the moment. I mean, you're not completely based in London, but we'll get into that. And I guess it's the beating heart of Britain for these discussions and that are going on across the country. So maybe you can kind of introduce where you're from and paint a picture as to like why you're sat in London today, apart from the podcast, of course.
I am currently actually interning with Ideas Matter, the organization that runs these different events. But I'm from Denmark, from Copenhagen, and I'm currently studying history in Dublin. Yeah, I went to the Battle of Ideas last year, which is another event that the Academy of Ideas runs, which is kind of linked to Ideas Matter. I went to the event and I really liked it and I really liked the atmosphere. It's sort of all dedicated to open debate and free expression. There were just debates on anything, which I found really inspiring. And then I just slowly got involved and started doing more volunteer work with the organization, and here I am.
How did you find out about all of these societies? Because I get the understanding that once you're in one, you get to know all of them, and then there's lots of crossover between them.
I think I've kind of been following along on the sidelines for a few years actually, because I'm from Copenhagen and it wasn't really easy to get to London. It didn't really make sense to come over for the battle, so I kind of knew of it. But then once I got to Dublin, it just wasn't that long of a journey, and then I thought I'd come over, and then it is just kind of, then you meet some people and then suddenly you're roped into different things, and there are a bunch of cool events that I hadn't even heard of that you can get involved in. So
yeah, and I see that writing for you as well, like writing articles is another way to kind of have your voice heard in these events. I mean, for me, I write articles as well, and I notice that sometimes it isn't that many people who read them, but it matters who reads them. So, for example, I think you published with the TNT, which is the Free Speech Champions Substack. In particular, I'm going to actually just read out a quote from this.
Sure.
So, in your article, Where Are the Adults in the Room? You write, "It is hard to think of an individual more privileged than the average university student today." So, that's quite a controversial thing to say. So as a history and politics undergraduate student, would you say you're a privileged student?
Definitely. So I actually don't think that this is that much of a controversial statement. If you're at university, then you've had opportunities in life. You've been able to go there. For me, I've been able to go to another country to study. I'm very, very lucky with the Danish welfare system that I get a stipend, which allows me to do this at all. So I think I'm very privileged there. And I think my article made the point that the universities are very much catering to this audience. And it's always talking about how we're under so much pressure as students and it must be so hard and we are the most depressed and the most anxious. And I just look at it and look at the people that I'm around at university, look at my friends, and we are a group of very, very privileged people. And I think that that's just important to recognize when we make these, when we make these arguments. I think it's important to recognize who's making them.
What do you mean by privilege?
I guess I just mean that you're in a position to make choices. You're in a position where there are many options open to you. If you've chosen university, that's one of the many paths you could have taken. Of course, some people are more privileged than others in a university setting, but by and large, you're able to not work. You don't have to work to survive, at least not more than part-time. And I think that's massive privilege. And I probably mostly say it's a financial privilege to be able to go to university.
It's quite interesting, I think, because you can look at different types of privileges, and maybe that's within a university context. But sometimes I hear a lot of these criticisms being posed at students where they kind of have to worry and think, oh, well, how am I not privileged? So they're kind of always having to think in the negative to find out how they're less privileged than someone else. I was wondering if any particular instance kind of made you recognize this, or was it just like a slow realization?
I think the thing that was really funny to me and kind of what sparked the article was that I read this statistic which said that university students were more depressed and more anxious than any group, like than the average sort of. And I just remember reading it and thinking, well, yeah, it's like 18 to 22-year-olds who have no clue what they're doing with their lives. They have no clue what they're up to. So obviously they're more depressed and anxious than the general population. But that has nothing to do with the fact that university is too much pressure or it's a horrible place to be. It's because you're 20. And when you're 20, you're confused and have like no goals in life, and you have goals, but they're all over the place and you might not reach them. So I think that was kind of what sparked it, that I think there's a lot of doom and gloom about what it is to be a student today and how hard it is and how much trouble we're in. And I actually don't think that's the case. I think we're very lucky, and I think that we should recognize that. Yes.
And I really find this idea of promoting debate among young people really interesting, because I remember when I was at school, we kind of had debates, but they weren't, I don't know, I don't feel like they were ever proper debates, or they were quite superficial. You know, you'd be like, okay, well, this side of the room's for, this side of the room's against. And I get why you do it, because you learn different viewpoints. But it seems to be a completely different context now within the universities, where we still have so-called debates, but maybe you're not allowed to express the wrong opinion for fear of getting cancelled. Is there a particular way that, you know, you're developing these programs with Ideas Matter to teach debate in a way that promotes, you know, what I would consider to be real debate, as opposed to debates that are happening, for example, in the unions in various universities? I remember thinking a case that comes to mind is at Royal Holloway not so long ago, when a speaker was not allowed to speak in a debate because they expressed the wrong opinion. I mean, you know, is that a debate?
Yeah, I think it's such a worrying situation. There are just a lot of cases of speakers not being invited because they are saying the wrong things. But I also think that I think that this kind of creates an atmosphere among the students, which does make it hard. Like, I remember reading a very, very interesting letter. I believe it was the kind of president of the Cambridge Union, who was talking about the issues that they've had in planning debates, so not necessarily in holding them. So the problem isn't mainly that speakers don't get invited, it's that as you are planning a debate, you're more worried about whether the conversation will be controversial than whether it'll be an interesting debate and whether it's something that people care about. And I think that's very worrying, because as someone who thinks that any opinion should be expressed, I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist on this, because I think that even those opinions that I deeply disagree with, and there are many, I want to know, like, I want to hear them, I want to have it out in the open. And I've noticed that people will express an opinion that I deeply disagree with, but then sort of they won't fully express it because they will be too afraid to say what they think. And I think that is a whole culture. It's not just about the speakers, it's about the way we interact with each other and the way that we treat our peers.
What I find really interesting as well, and you just touched on the issue of, like, if someone expresses something that you don't agree with, you let them say the opinion. But then I find it really hard sometimes, like, you know, we talk of cancel culture and what does it mean to, like, be cancelled in the first place? But if someone expresses an opinion and then you say, you know, you're wrong, like, how is that different to cancelling someone?
Well, I think a lot of the cancelling is either disinviting a speaker, which just seems rude, and the other part is this never really taking up the debate in the first place. I think it stems from the idea that if just we don't hear it, if just we, like, shut it out, then it doesn't exist. And I think that the opposite is true. You know, you look at the rise of someone like Andrew Tate, who I find deeply despicable, but there is a sense in which people can hide behind the fact that he is cancelled, and they can feel vindicated in following him because he doesn't get the time of day, because many people aren't even willing to hear what he has to say. And I'm actually of the opinion that if people properly listened to what Andrew Tate had to say, they'd realize that he's a moron. And I think that's the crucial point. You need to have a bit of faith in the people who are listening to these people and the people who argue these things, because people do actually change their minds, and people do actually recognize that their heroes sometimes fall short. And free and open discussion is part of that. So if we just cancel people, then all the people that follow them behind the scenes, who will continue to be exposed to them online, you can find anything online, they'll just get further entrenched in those opinions rather than changing and rather than opening up.
Yeah, and maybe their opinions won't ever be challenged, because if you can't express it, then you're not going to change it. You're probably just going to feel quite bitter, resentful, and it might get even more extreme.
Exactly.
Have you found, you're at Trinity College now, what have you found it to be like there? Have any students, found some of your articles? Because some of them get quite controversial. So I'll read out another quote. I love quoting you, Felice. Get some real snippets here. This is in the article, Where Are the Adults in the Room Again? You write, quote, "University curriculums are increasingly dumbed down to fit the needs of a group largely comprised of privileged brats, suffering from bad time management skills and a few too many beers. Students are no longer expected to learn to deal with challenging material and a heavy workload because it is too much pressure." So, which brats are you talking about here, and have they responded?
Well, so I think I'm talking about all of us, and I think that's kind of why I haven't actually met a lot of heavy criticism. So I've shared it with my friends and with others, and I think people feel seen in it in a way, in a weird way, but kind of being called out on your bullshit is sometimes necessary. And I think that if you frame things in the right way, if you tell things respectfully, I obviously do use the word brats, but I also think that the idea that actually our largest problem, and this is something we all talk about, is that when exam time rolls around, everyone realizes that, maybe I should have studied more during term. And then we were just drinking beers and having fun. And that's part of the university experience. But then complaining about exam pressure is ridiculous. And I think that most people read that and kind of go, oh, right, that's actually kind of true. That's actually exactly what it's like to be here. And you can get pulled out of your kind of loop of complaining and collectively deciding that university is out to get you by recognizing your own role in it.
Don't you think it can be quite comforting though, just playing devil's advocate here? During exam season, everyone's there and they're going, should have studied more. But it might be more of like a group feel, a sense of community. So what do you say to that angle? Well,
I think that's true, and I very much enjoy. I think that's also why I've called the article "Where Are the Adults in the Room?" because I actually don't think that there's anything wrong with students complaining about exams and doing all these things. I think the problem is that the university started to respond by making exams easier and taking out things from the curriculum that are difficult. And that's a whole nother level. That's what the article is complaining about. I think the article is complaining about. That's what I was pointing out, is that students should be allowed to complain. Students should be allowed to think that it's the whole world's fault that they can't pass their exam. But the teachers, the professors, the administration has to step back and say, well, actually, you are being children, you're being ridiculous, and we will not stand for this. And there's a symbiotic relationship between the adults who think the kids are ridiculous and the kids who think the adults are unfair. And that's just how it is. And I think my article, I want to kind of reclaim that distinction. I want to make sure that there's a space for students complaining without everything just being dropped because of it.
Yeah, because I guess these issues really kind of highlight the question, what is the role of the university, especially, in our age where everyone's on social media, who should the universities be answering to? Because I know, for example, quite recently there's been some new universities that have been founded on the principle of free speech and, almost against the idea that the university should supply, almost like welfare provisions and care. They say, it should just be for education. We shouldn't be invading students' lives. Like, they are here, they pay us good money to go and learn, and we will teach them as, I guess, authorities on the subjects. So just to give an example, I've just come back from the University of Texas in Austin, which is one of the new universities founded on the idea of free speech. And what really struck me is that, in the media nowadays, the idea of free speech is often associated with like right-wing politics. And this university had a real range of people. So just to put it in context, like someone in my class was a socialist. Some, other people in the class just didn't know what they were. They were still trying to figure it out. The thing that everyone was saying, though, was that free speech isn't just for the right wing. Maybe this feeds into these issues why we're so scared to talk, because people are just worried that they're going to be labelled. Has this been your experience?
Yeah, I think this is the most hilarious thing I've found since getting into all of this, because I've always seen myself as quite a progressive. And I am quite a progressive. I fully believe in women's rights and liberation of all sorts. I'm actually very into freedom. That's kind of why I'm doing this whole summer school thing. But it seems like I have met around the block just sort of, oh, you must be a conservative, you must be right wing. And it was actually a friend of mine who agreed with me on many things, and was in a similar boat to me, who at a certain point kind of said, well, you're kind of on the right? And I just looked at him completely baffled, because no, I'm not. And I come from probably the most liberal country in Europe. We have a great welfare system that, in the US, even the right-wing parties in Denmark are way far left. So I am I would probably be classed as very, very left-wing in most forums. So, but on this issue, it seems that free speech has become the dividing line. It's become the thing where if you claim to be in favor of free speech, you're suddenly placed on the far right, which is a ridiculous twist of fate, because that is the opposite of what free speech has been historically. It's been the thing that has allowed all these liberation campaigns, allowed all these people to express their rights, to claim their rights. Because when you are a minority, that's when you need free speech.
Yeah, I mean, The Guardian itself was founded as a free speech journal. And often, I hear it said, and it's true, that free speech is a tool for the minorities. I mean, we've had other guests for this podcast, and they come from very different, political standpoints. They're not even thinking really about what politics are, but they just know that free speech is integral to peace, really. Like, how do you think that free speech leads to peace? Like, what do you think the relation is between the two?
I don't necessarily think so. So I'm of the opinion that things like free speech, democracy, are sort of, we have to take them as goods in themselves. So if they lead to something that we don't like, if they don't lead to peace, if they don't lead to all the other values that we support, we still need to support democracy and freedom of speech. So I don't think that there is a relationship between freedom of speech and particular political ideologies. I hope that the arguments for peace, the arguments for, a larger welfare system, a better welfare system, that they're the ones that will win out in the battle of ideas. But I can't be certain, because I don't know who I'm meeting. And if there's anything I've learned from traveling around, it is that varies greatly depending on where you're from. So the things that will happen in various circumstances based on free speech will be different. And that's part of the good thing. That's part of the beauty of free speech. But I think that I never really, growing up, I never really questioned free speech. I was never taught to question whether that was a good or bad thing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna move on now actually to views on feminism, because I don't know, I've read through your articles, as you know, and we've been talking a lot recently, the two of us, I guess, in terms of feminism and free speech. I know that you're involved in like a group of mine that I'm starting, where we can kind of discuss issues as a group of women who come together, which I think creates a completely different dynamic, and hopefully you thought the same too from the first event. But I was wondering, before we get into your article, your review of Mary Harrington's book, which has actually been labelled quite conservative by others, so I'd be interested to hear about your opinion of that label. But first, would you describe yourself as a feminist?
Yeah, so I have a hard time with labels in general, because I think, a word like feminist, it means so many different things to different people. So if feminist to you means equality of the sexes, then I am a feminist. But if feminist to you means, trigger warnings and subscribing to the idea that we live in a rape culture and that the world is out to get women and that the world sucks for women, then I'm not a feminist. So I think depending on who you are and what you think a feminist is, I am or I'm not a feminist. I don't think I'm too bothered about that term. I'd say I'm probably for women's liberation. I'm for the idea that women are strong and able to make their own choices and able to have their own lives, and that this should be an option open to anyone. And that includes various rights, but it also includes a freedom from this, what I see as this kind of organization of protection that's being kind of pushed onto women, this idea that we need the government to protect us, that we need men around us to, protect us all the time.
Yeah, it was really, I've been reading an article recently, like quite an old article that I'm rereading, by a feminist called Joan Didion, and I think she's 1970s, I want to say.
Yes.
But she was basically a critic of this type of feminism, which was like, oh, we need to protect women, like trigger warnings, whatever, although it wasn't trigger warnings back then. But yeah, I was just wondering, like, have you come, it sounds like you've come across Joan Didion, and it was quite interesting because she's like, I think she's, I don't want to get it wrong, but she's quite like a very left wing, really. She's like quite Marxist because she's very interested in ideas of class.
Yes.
And in my mind at the moment, I'm really thinking about class a lot because I think almost we've lost class in this idea about privileges, and class was one of the original terminologies that we'd use to analyze these groups that were, oppressed against each other. So does class fit in quite a lot of your version of feminism?
I think it definitely does. I think my version of feminism, I'd like to think it's inclusive of all women, because I very much subscribe to the idea that women should have choices, and that depending on where you are in life and where you come from, whether you come from a more conservative background and want to be supported in starting a family, or whether you come from a more liberal framework where you want to kind of go out and make your own money and have that life, or whether you come from a poor background where you'll need different things. I think that this idea of choice encapsulates all of that. I read a very interesting article by Wendy Kaminer, who argued that, this is the lifeblood of feminism. This is what feminism was when it originally got on the scene. And she takes, various cases that are going on today with the way women are being talked about and treated in the media. But I kind of like the stance that she takes, which is it's just a bit ridiculous, and it makes women seem ridiculous and weak. And women are anything but ridiculous and weak.
Yeah, and do you think maybe this culture of trigger warnings as well? Like, I almost feel like as university students, kind of wrapped in cotton wool, and women especially, you get told a lot of things. And the idea that you can receive a trigger warning for a book because it might offend you. Yeah, trigger warning. Are you triggered by trigger warnings?
So I think, if you really want to put trigger warnings on things, by all means, but I will continue to find it ridiculous. First of all, there's the whole discussion about whether they even work or whether they just make people aware that there is something, in that book or not. But as someone who studies history, I spend most of my time, looking at source material from atrocities. All these things were wars. All these things are very triggering, if you want to even use that term, but actually they're just disturbing. And that's part of what it is to be studying at university. It is that you will be exposed to disturbing things. And I think we're very particular about the kinds of things that we've decided to put trigger warnings in our culture. And they do kind of show a certain mindset that just doesn't really make sense and that wouldn't really be used anywhere else. So for example, the idea that rape is something that should particularly have a trigger warning. It just kind of singles out that as like, this is the thing that is horrible, and everything else that you might experience is somehow not as bad or couldn't be as triggering to read about. I just don't think that's the case. I just think trigger warnings are useless, if not actively harmful, and actively making people think that they should somehow be harmed by reading something that's disturbing or horrible or morally bankrupt.
Yeah, and for, if we were to push this case of trigger warnings a bit more, and the idea of privilege, I sometimes think, if you live in a world where you can ignore certain issues and turn your eye, maybe that is a bit more of a position of privilege. I mean, these things, just because you can't trigger a book which mentions rape doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it might just mean that you can't support someone who might have gone through that, who's a close friend of yours. I mean, if I'd never read, I don't know, like Lolita, say, I wouldn't be as aware of how awful the protagonist, the main writer. I mean, it's a book about a man falling in love with a child, and you're kind of aware of how disturbing and how twisted the mind might be, and in a way, it can really help to guard you against those things when they do happen in real life. Because I mean, terrible things happen in real life, they really do, and whether literature can just be almost like an induction to help you deal with it.
Yeah, I think literature is so powerful in it that in many ways it introduces us to the more dark aspects of ourselves. I think the people who induce these trigger warnings and who they have a very rosy view of what humanity is like. They have the idea sort of that if we just shield people from a young age, from these things, then somehow they won't be tainted and won't ever develop dark thoughts or won't ever develop these other parts of our personality that might not be as palatable as the rest. I think, the case of Roald Dahl and the removal of certain words in there that were something like the woman had a horsey face, or even the description of someone as fat.
But what was the woman with the horsey face? What was that changed?
Well, I don't remember what it was changed to, but I just remember that sort of she was not allowed to have a horsey face because that was rude or something. But actually, Roald Dahl's descriptions are exactly how children describe things that they don't understand. And as you grow older, you develop distinctions and you recognize that it's rude to treat people that way. The idea that we can just hide this from children and then they'll never develop rudeness or bad thoughts, I think is very, misplaced. It's misguided, and literature is beautiful in that it introduces us to those things in a safer environment, where we don't, for the first time, have a bad thought out in the real world, but that we recognize it in something we're reading.
It was interesting. It's almost like a distance that you put between yourself that you kind of realize through a book. You've got a document and then you can compare where you are and where the document was when it was written. I mean, you study history now, and I studied history for my undergraduate, and recently I've been thinking about this idea of historical documentation or historical sources. And the more I think about it, the more I think that works of literature should be treated in exactly the same way as a historical document, almost. You couldn't tamper a report from World War II, written by a Nazi officer. Imagine if you changed the words in that. I mean, firstly, you'd be incredibly triggered. But you kind of read that and you think, that's terrible. We must distance ourselves from this because we know it's different from now, and that's something to be celebrated. But if you don't have that document, if you don't have that book even to show that state of mind, then I guess you can become blind to it. And do you think history can repeat itself?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely the case. And I find it so funny that it's, that is a sanitation of it. It's taking, there's a beloved Swedish children's author who everyone, she's a brilliant, imaginative author. And because she wrote in the 40s, I believe, she used a lot of language that was outdated and also actively probably not the best way of describing a certain thing. So the father of Pippi Longstocking is a sailor or a pirate, I believe, and he is described as a king of the N-words, and he is described as someone who, they've changed it to King of the South Seas, but this idea that a white man comes down to an island in the South Seas and is their leader is a deeply problematic kind of idea that we no longer subscribe to. But I think it's important that that's something that we continue to look at her as. She was imaginative, she was brilliant, and this was also part of her world. And we shouldn't separate it and just sanitize that out so that she's somehow now this perfect person in the modern world, because she's not. She's complicated, and she has all sorts of ideas that are shaped by her time and shaped by her own, experiences. And we are losing something if we just cut out the things that we don't like in our current environment.
I think these distinctions between these documents, and you're so right, is in using the N word, for example, we wouldn't use that. We know it's awful, but almost like these books put it in our face and tell us, they remind us not to use that. So we read it in a very different context now. But does this move towards sometimes altering history? Is that something that comes up in your classes? Like, do you when you're at Trinity College, do people discuss these issues in a very active way in the classrooms, or are some issues just taboo, or how do people approach them?
I feel very lucky in studying history in that it seems like people are more willing to have these more controversial discussions and talk about, what mindset leads you to take part in the witch hunts, for example. What are these things? You're much more likely to engage with that in a historical context because it's easier to deal with. It's easier to deal with the idea that people in the past were horrible, that it is to deal with the idea that today people still have abhorrent views about things that we need to deal with. So I think in that way I feel very lucky to be studying history because that is a frame in which you can discuss these things and in which all the different aspects of humanity are brought out.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember the first time I read Thucydides, I'd never studied any classics before university, but I just remember reading Thucydides and how he constructed history as well. And you got a real sense that he was a so-called professional historian, the first professional historian. But, by him admitting that, he was putting his own narrative forward, this idea of a subjective view, which is so, so true. And it's almost like the study of history makes us realize how much we create these personal ideologies ourselves, I guess, and we want to try and unpick them to understand how other people think. I'm really curious as well, your experience at university, because I feel like, in the press, a lot of people say about university campuses, how they're so bad, the terms woke and non-woke are thrown around quite a lot. What's it like in Ireland? You must have heard what people have said about the UK.
I've found people to be actually quite receptive to many ideas around free speech and to be very open to it. The main problem I run into is just that I don't think students have developed an understanding of why free speech is important. I don't think that we've ever lived in a time where free speech was under threat by people we didn't like. So if you are a staunch leftist university student, then you're not likely to see a problem with free speech because you haven't ever experienced what it's like to live in a stifling environment. So I think there's just a lot of work to be done, which is more a positive case than a kind of negative case. Just a positive case for free speech and why it's important, even for those you disagree with, and why it's important for everyone to be heard. The thing I hear most often is the idea that free speech is important with the exception of hate speech. So I spend a lot of time kind of just arguing for the fact that hate speech, arguing about, what does hate speech mean? How do we define it? Can we define it? Is there a way of separating it out? And my belief is that there isn't really, that it is near impossible to make any sort of determination about what counts and what doesn't.
Yeah.
But I think that's not as clear cut in many students' minds. So that's the positive case I have to make rather than there being a negative environment in the first place, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree, because I do sometimes think, when I look back at my undergrad, I wasn't really aware of these issues, and, there's been certain things which have stuck in my mind that have kind of alarmed me, but just some of them have been quite isolated, and I sometimes wonder when is the time to shift the perspective to almost celebrate the moments of free speech, or, not create this impression that it's every class, every student. Because most people, I've come across, and maybe it's naive faith, but are very moderate, very nice, and they're not particularly that bothered. But maybe there's a problem in not being bothered, and then it creates that environment, like you said, that people are unaware of why it's important, and it can kind of contribute to a whole, the minority speaking the loudest.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense in which there are some issues that it's hard to talk about. And I've heard this from many people at university. There are certain issues that are just touchy. But I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and I'm not actually sure that it's a problem when certain issues become touchy, but there are always going to be issues that are touchy in the sense that there is kind of a dynamic of who has power and like what group is being, singled out here. So I think that there is also room to be careful about the way we approach certain topics. And I think that's, as someone who wants to be a journalist, who wants to be a writer and do things this way, I do actually have to think about the ways in which I present certain topics and the ways in which I frame things. That doesn't mean that I should ever hold back what my true beliefs are, but I do need to be aware of how I best present them.
Yeah, because I'd recommend anyone to read your articles because, you really do speak your mind. And I think that's kind of rare. Like, what year are you in now for your undergraduate? Is it?
I'm just finished first year.
Just finished first year. And to have like such a strong voice, maybe you'll look back and you'll see some of these opinions and you think, oh, my opinion's so different now. That's why it's kind of, I guess it's useful to compare how your thinking changes.
Yes.
But it is rare to have such a strong voice already, which is why I find your writing very interesting and, hopefully inspirational to others just like me who read it. But did you have, I hear some people saying about free speech who are like advocates of free speech and they just speak their mind, that they had like a particular coming out moment almost. I guess it's different for you because you grew up in a country where free speech was almost like made the norm by the government on a quite strong way. But can you remember a time when maybe in Dublin, you said something that you're like, oh, I don't know whether I should say this?
Yeah, I don't know, because I think, I was lucky in the fact that Denmark had this free speech reckoning when I was 8. So I didn't at that point really have a relationship to it. All I knew was what was kind of going on. So I never really had a coming out moment in that way. I just kind of grew up with the value. And I think the moments I've had in Dublin has mostly just been, exactly when people say something, when people say something on the issue of free speech that I don't agree with, something like, free speech except for hate speech, or kind of come with platitudes about how they do support freedom of expression, but just not limitless or anything. I kind of bump into it like, oh, I will need to take up this discussion now. But I don't think that that's anything that dissuades me from doing so. And I never really feel afraid to express it to them or to push back, because I don't actually think that our political opinions are everything. And I think we can separate out people from, the political differences we hold. And if someone is really gonna not be friends with me because of my position on free speech or women's rights or something like that, I struggle to see how we would engage in a friendship in the first place, because I am quite vocal about the things I believe in. And most of my beliefs are positive cases. My arguments for women's rights are based around the idea that I don't think it's good for women to feel so afraid all the time. One of the statistics I'm very frightened by is the fact that 22% of young women don't feel safe socializing at night on campus, which, that is not just because it's unsafe. That's also because of the culture that is telling young women like me that I'm supposed to be afraid, that I have a high likelihood of being raped. And I think I'm making a positive case that women actually don't have to be afraid and that women are strong and resilient and can do things. So I am going to express that opinion, and I am going to take whatever controversy comes with that.
Yeah, they often seem like kind of Victorian ideas of what it is to be a woman, be overcome with emotion and so vulnerable.
Exactly.
This podcast is called Against the Grain, but it's quite interesting because it already seems within your mindset you're not doing anything different for you. But if I put you in, I don't know, the University of Cambridge campus in a particular class, you would be going against the grain to say those things. Like, what would your advice be for a student who is in your position and maybe didn't have your mindset though, when they were like, oh, I can't say this, but I really want to say it? What would your advice be?
I think there's something to be said for, while you should go against the grain, not doing it for the sake of it. I don't think that we should ever be controversial or pushing boundaries in our own opinions for the sake of pushing boundaries or being controversial. I think that you need to be so grounded in the beliefs that you have, and you need to be sure that they come from a good place within you and that you have a vision with it, and that you have something that you would like to express. And then, whether that takes you with the grain or against the grain, you should go with it. And I think that that's one of the important things, that while I defend free speech for everyone, I'm not going to take up a controversial opinion for the sake of taking up a controversial opinion. It just happens to be the case that some of the deeply held opinions I have are controversial in some circles, and that's what it's like for everyone.
Maybe it's more of a case of a slow going against the grain. I mean, if you have time to consider your opinion, likely it's not going to be so extreme because you've had time to explore the other side. I mean, whenever I come to an issue, I try and read, almost convince myself of what I think I'm not going to agree with. And I find that that's really interesting, because even in these conferences like Living Freedom, and you think, oh, everyone's going to be expressing their opinions, there's going to be loads of arguments. It's not, because you actually listen to the other side. And then, you've had time to almost cool off, or whatever it was. It was a very electrifying atmosphere, but never conflict, I'd say. So I think if people take that time, think about their own opinions, then free speech doesn't become such a controversial thing. It just becomes a cooling off method.
Yeah, I also think it's hard for everyone. You still get a certain sense of ick when you're going against something that the person you're talking to is saying. If you disagree with someone, there is a certain discomfort there. I just don't think that discomfort is a bad thing. And I think no matter whether I'm in a super progressive or a very conservative environment, there's work to be done to stand fast on the opinions I have. And that's kind of part of the beauty. You need to have the same opinions, whether you're talking to a conservative or a liberal or anyone in the middle. You need to be consistent with the views that you have and not change them based on who you're talking to.
Idea of integrity, I guess, and closing that gap between cognitive dissonance and what you actually experience and believe like day to day on a basis. This has been super interesting, Felice, and we could talk forever, I'm sure. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining and kind of sharing your experience. I'm really excited where your career takes you. Just to finish off though, what is your ultimate career aim? I know you said about a journalist, but is that your aim, and if so, which publication?
Oh, interesting. So, well, it's always lovely talking to you, and thank you so much for having me on. But I think, I want to be a journalist, and I haven't really thought through how that'll be. I'd like to go into print journalism most likely, just because I like writing. I prefer that format. I'll see where it takes me. I'll see. I had a dream for a long time about writing for The Economist, and I think I'll stick to that. But wherever it takes me.
Great. Well, I'll be following your career and see your writing. Excited for your writing to come. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Against the Grain is a podcast by Ella Nixon, thanks to the support of the Ian McTaggart programme, administered by the Free Speech Union.